So we're going to be in the book of Micah. And if you got a Bible, you can open it up to the book of Micah. If you don't have a Bible, there are like stacks and stacks of Bibles there on the back. Feel free to grab one. Just a little bit about where Micah is situated in the Bible. Micah is near the back of the Old Testament, and it is part of something called the Book of 12, or the Minor Prophets. And the minor prophets are books like Micah and Jonah and Amos and Haggai. And the reason they're called minor prophets is not because they're minor in importance, but because they're shorter in length than like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or any of those guys. And yet Micah packs a pretty potent message. Micah was actually a contemporary of another prophet, very famous in the Old Testament, Isaiah. They did their ministries at the same time. And Micah's ministry was pretty lengthy. It spanned from approximately 735 BC to about the year 700 BC. And Micah really had kind of a tough and rough go of it because Micah was trying to warn the nation of Israel about what was to come in its history before it was history. Because a couple of watershed moments in the history of the nation of Israel. The first is 722 BC, which if you look at Micah's ministry, he was there for. And this is when the nation of Assyria came in and ransacked a bunch of the nation of Israel. Now, the next big watershed date was 701 BC, and this is when the city of Jerusalem itself fell to the nation of Assyria. Then the next big date is 586 BC, and this is when the nation of Assyria was kind of waning, and it had been taken over by the empire of Babylon, and the Babylonians came in, and they ransacked the nation of Israel, and they carried it off into exile. Now, at this time, 735, when Micah begins his ministry, he kind of gets like a prophetic picture into what is to come in the history of the nation of Israel. The Assyrians, and what's going to happen to Jerusalem, and what's going to happen with the Babylonians, how the whole nation is going to fall apart. And the reason that it's going to fall apart, okay, just to summarize it in one theological word, is this: S-I-N, sin. The nation of Israel is rebelling against God in a bunch of different ways. And so Micah is meant to be kind of a warning voice to say, all of this is going to come if you don't straighten up and fly right. And so we're just going to dive in here, and we'll work through the first chapter of Micah this morning. And so if you got your Bibles, Micah chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord, which, by the way, the reason that Micah knows all of this is going to happen before it happens is because Micah is not just speaking from himself, he's speaking on behalf of someone else. He's speaking on behalf of the Lord. This is not Micah's word ultimately. This is the Lord's word finally. And what we're going to see, okay, is that Micah does two things. He speaks in the present tense, okay, to their current situation. You guys are doing this right now. And then he also speaks in the future tense because of what you guys are doing right now. This is what is going to happen to you. But if you change the present, here's the message: you can save the future, because what you do now doesn't just have effects on now, it has effects on later. Now, this is just a practical lesson I think that we can all learn, right? The decisions that we make now don't just affect right now, they affect later. You know, how you deal with that struggle in your marriage right now doesn't just affect your marriage right now. It affects, like, you know, later, and whether you make it to the end of your marriage when death does you part. Or how you treat your kids or your grandkids right now, the kind of time and effort and energy that you pour into them. It doesn't just affect right now. It can indeed have effects on later, what your relationship looks like with your kids later. In fact, I have this kind of just goal in mind, and here's the thing: I don't know if I'm going to accomplish it because there are lots of variables, but kind of the prayer that I pray for my kids all the time is that they still want to come home even when they don't have to come home. In other words, I'd love to raise them in such a way, like when they're, 20s, 30s, they still want to get together for the holidays, and they still kind of like their mom and dad. And that's kind of my mark on the wall. And so I always ask myself, okay, is what I'm doing now when I'm like really, really frustrated with them, okay? Is that going to contribute to that ultimate goal? How I live in the present really does have an effect on the future. And so Micah, because he has the word of the Lord in him, he can give a good theological analysis of the present, but then he also knows quite a bit about what's going to happen in the future. And so back to Micah 1, verse 1, the word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth, that is his hometown, kind of in southwestern Judah, near the southern half of the nation of Israel. During the reigns of these three kings of Judah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, all kings of Judah. Now, if you notice right there, kind of in the bullseye in the middle, is this king Ahaz. And Ahaz was, when Micah did most of his ministry, Ahaz was a bad dude. Okay, Ahaz was so bad that he would sacrifice kids to false gods. And so this guy was bad news, a bad dude, and Micah is trying to speak into Israel when it is spiritually at its darkest. And so Micah gets a vision, this is back to verse 1, concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Now, at this time in the history of the nation of Israel, Israel was divided into two parts and two portions. There was the northern half of the nation of Israel, and there was the southern half of the nation of Israel. The southern half of the nation of Israel was generally were like a king who was a descendant of Israel's greatest king, King David, reigned and ruled. The northern half of the nation of Israel was kind of a free-for-all when it came to kings, because the nation of Israel split in two after the reign of David's son, King Solomon. And so notice what Micah says. I have a vision concerning Samaria. That's in the north. And Jerusalem, that's in the south. Now, the nation of Israel at this time kind of saw themselves as two different halves doing their own things, the northern half and the southern half. What Micah is going to do is he's going to say, whether you're in the northern part of Israel or the southern part of Israel, it doesn't really matter. This is for everyone. Everyone is struggling spiritually. Everyone needs to be careful spiritually. Everyone needs to repent spiritually. And so this is not just like a regional problem. This is a national problem, Micah would say. But actually it goes further than that. Verse 2, hear you peoples, all of you, listen. Now, what's the next word there? Earth. Okay. How much does the earth include? Just out of curiosity. Everything. So Micah says, hear you peoples, all of you, listen earth and all who live in it, that the sovereign Lord may bear witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. So Micah begins by saying, I have a word for Samaria in the north and Jerusalem in the south. This is not just a regional problem. This is a national problem. But it's not just a national problem. It's a human problem, a worldwide problem. Ultimately, my prophetic word is not just for Jerusalem. It's not just for Samaria. It's not just for Israel. It's for everyone. Everyone. And this is part of the reason that these prophetic books, I believe, are still incredibly practical for us even today, because the prophets address human problems. Human problems. And so one of the things I'd encourage you to ask as we kind of work through chapter 1 and the rest of the book is, how are their problems reflective of my problems? Because human beings don't change much, okay? And so notice the second half of verse 2. The sovereign Lord is going to bear witness, Micah says, against you. And so the scene is almost a courtroom. God has a problem with people. And God is fixing to bring his case against people. And he's going to come and bring his case from his holy temple. Let me say something about this picture of God coming from his holy temple. One of the big problems that the people of Israel had in this day and age is that they were big on temple worship. And they would bring all sorts of sacrifices to the temple. And they figured as long as they were going to church and singing the songs and chanting the chants and making the sacrifices and giving the gifts and doing the thing, as long as they showed up on Sunday, everything was going to be okay. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, no matter how they lived their lives. As long as they did the temple right, everything else was going to be okay. Just show up on Sunday, and spiritually, you're good. Now, the book of Micah, one of the major themes in this whole book, is Micah trying to deconstruct that attitude. Because that's not the way that faith works. That's not the way that following God works. There are two super duper famous passages in the book of Micah. One has to do with the prophecy of where Jesus is going to be born in Bethlehem, but the other is Micah 6, verse 8, where Micah says to the people of Israel, he has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Has anybody heard this verse before? Okay. To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's what faith lived out looks like. Faith lived out does not just look like going to church on Sunday. It looks like acting justly in all your dealings. It looks like loving mercy, not treating people how their sins deserve. That's tough. And then walking humbly. Not thinking you know it all, have it all together with your God. And so at the very beginning of the book, notice what God does, okay? He comes out of his holy temple. He says, you know what? You guys are so busy going here and making all these sacrifices to me. I'm stepping out of the holy temple so that you guys can't just look there and go, I can go to church and be good. And I'm going to address you directly outside of the holy temple, because what you're doing outside of the holy temple is the problem. And so let me show you what the problem is. Verse 3. Look, the Lord is coming from his dwelling place, and he comes down and he treads on the heights of the earth. Now, at the end of verse 3, we get this little phrase, the heights of the earth. In Hebrew, this actually is just a Hebrew word that means high places. Now, all over the Old Testament, if you read through it, you will actually see this phrase, high places. And high places were used in the ancient world to denote pagan places of worship. And kind of the theology at work behind these high places in the ancient world was this. God, or, okay, in the ancient conception, the gods, because a lot of them were polytheists, are way up there. And we are way down here. And so if we're going to worship the gods in a way that they can hear us and see us and notice us, and if we are way down here, okay, and the gods and goddesses and all these other things are way up there, here's what we ought to do. We ought to find the tallest mountain and put our church right there. Because then we'll be able to get a little closer. And we see this like all over the ancient world. Anybody ever heard of a place called Mount Olympus? Anybody ever heard of that? Okay, it's in ancient Greece, or modern day Greece too. It's still there. Okay, it is the tallest mountain in Greece. Now, if you go back and you read like old Greek mythology, did anybody have to do that like in high school or college, like Zeus and Poseidon, all those guys? Remember some of that? You know, Zeus, lightning bolt guy, okay, Poseidon, god of the sea, all those folks. The ancients believed they all lived on top of the highest mountain peak in ancient Greece, because the gods are way up there and human beings are way down here. That was just the theological assumption. There was this massive chasm that separated humanity from God, or from the gods and the goddesses. Now, one of the really interesting things about even ancient Israelite theology, okay, is that it involves a mountain. There's a really famous mountain with Moses. Remember this? 10 Commandments. Okay. Anybody remember what it's called? Okay. Now, what's interesting about Mount Sinai is that it's not the tallest peak in that area. It's the smallest peak in that area. It's the shortest one. It's surrounded by mountains that are all taller than it. Because the real God is undoing a bit of bad theology that people assume with all the false gods. You don't have to get to the highest place, the high places to get to God, because it's not about you ascending a mountain. It's about God descending to you. And notice what God does too. In Micah 1 verse 3. Look, you're not going to God's dwelling place. The Lord is coming what? From his dwelling place. Remember, the center of Christian theology, right, is not that we got to go to a high place to get to God. It's that Jesus descends to the lowest place as God to get to us. To a manger, to a cross, to a tomb, to this earth. And so we get a little foretaste of that in Micah 1 verse 3. Look, the Lord is coming from his dwelling place. And he comes down and he treads on all these high places. And look at what he does to them. The mountains, all the highest mountains go. That's it. They melt right beneath them. And the valleys split apart. Like wax before the fire, like water rushing down a slope. All the places where people think they can climb to get closer to God before the real God, they just fall apart and turn into mush. Because it's not about people climbing to God. It's about God coming to us. Verse 5. Why is God coming down? Why is everything melting before him? Here's why. All this is because of Jacob's transgression. This is Micah's main message. Bad stuff is coming, and why? It's because of sin. So all this is because of Jacob's transgression, because of the sins of the people of Israel. What is Jacob's transgression? Is it not Samaria, the northern half of Israel? But then here's the southern half of Israel. What is Judah's high place? Is it not Jerusalem? Now, a couple of things here that I want you to notice, all right? Number one, notice where Micah locates the heart of sin. He locates the heart of sin within the nation of Israel. Samaria, Judah, Jerusalem. Micah's big problem. He addresses the rest of the world out there and he says, you guys got issues too. But then he turns his eyes with a laser focus and says, but here's where it all starts. It all starts with the people who should know better. It all starts with the nation of Israel. You know, one of the biggest debates in Christianity, and this is a modern debate, but it's also an ancient debate, centers around this question. What is the biggest threat to the church? Is it out there? Or is it right here? And what Micah does is he says, you know, before you go looking out there, and there are problems out there, he's not denying that, okay, right? He's speaking to the whole world. But before we go way out there, we ought to start right here. Because we got our own problems. We got our own sins that we need to repent of. We got our own struggles that we need to endure and deal with and address. Or as Jesus puts it, why do you look at a speck in somebody else's eye when there's like a giant 2x4 hanging out of your own eye? If you want to help somebody with the speck, right? And by the way, it's good to help other people with the speck, but you don't start with the speck, you start with you and the sin that you're struggling with. Same message in Micah. Now, here's the other thing I want you to notice, okay? Look at the second half of verse 5, okay? Micah makes this very interesting statement. What is Judah's, and Judah is the southern half of the nation of Israel. What is Judah's high place? It is what? Jerusalem. Now, for anybody listening to Micah prophesying here, that would have been a shocking and quite frankly, appalling statement. And here's why. Jerusalem, right, is where the temple is. Jerusalem is where the theological center of gravity in ancient Israel was. Okay, all the pagans, they had all their high places with all their weird and wacky and gross and disgusting rituals. They were pagan and they were gross. And yeah, the high places are bad. But we don't have a high place. We have a temple. We have Jerusalem. We have Mount Zion. And Micah says, well, honestly, there's not much of a difference between all those other high places and your city of Jerusalem. Question is why? Is because what they were doing on Sunday was not reflected Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Yeah, they'd go to the temple. Yeah, they'd sing the praise songs. Yeah, they'd make their offerings. But it wasn't worship. It was just empty ritual. In fact, let me let you in on a little secret, okay? In biblical theology, any place can become a high place. Any place. How do you make it a high place? It's wherever you're trying to manipulate God. That's your high place. God, I'm going to give you lots of money, and you're going to bless me abundantly in return, right? I give $2, you give me 20. What have you done? You've just turned your giving into a high place. God, yes, I have my faith on Sunday, but let's face it, there's a real world out there Monday through Friday. And so, I kind of got to do what I got to do. What have you done? You've just turned your Sunday worship into a high place. God, come on now. I've been good to you. My faith has been strong in you, and you're still not giving me what I want. I've prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. Your answer needs to be yes. I mean, come on now. It's obviously a good prayer that I'm praying. What have you done? Just turn your own prayers into a high place. Any place can become a high place. And so, here comes the hammer of judgment. Boom, boom, boom. Verse 6. Therefore, God says, I'm going to make Samaria, northern half of Israel, a heap of rubble. Sounds nice. Kind of a scorched earth policy God has here. Okay. A place for planting vineyards. I'm going to pour her stones into the valley and lay bare all her foundations. And then, verse 7. Okay. This sounds awful, but it's a beautiful verse of hope. And we'll find out why in just a second. Listen very carefully. Verse 7. All her idols will be broken to pieces. All her temple gifts will be burned with fire. I will destroy all her images, since she gathered her gifts from the wages of prostitutes, very picturesque. As the wages of prostitutes, they will again be used. I'm going to start with the last half of the verse first. This whole idea of gathering her gifts from the wages of prostitutes. One of the big things that the nation of Israel was struggling with, okay, was what we would call in our day and age, pluralism, okay? And basically pluralism says this. There's the God of Israel, and he's all right. Okay, the God of Israel is just all right with me. But we live in a world where there are other gods and other goddesses, and we wouldn't want to be offensive and say that, our God is the, only God. And so we'll worship him, and then we'll, at least pay homage to these gods and to these goddesses. And so God has a word for this, okay? Prostitution. What is he saying? He's saying, hey, have you been cheating on me? Is that incense you burn to another god that I smell when you come home at night? It's like this super picturesque, indictment of the nation of Israel. And this takes us back to the first half of the verse, okay? We have all of these idols that are going to be broken to pieces, and all of these temple gifts that are going to be burned with fire, and all of these images that are going to be destroyed. You know, all these other gods and goddesses, you know, they had idols, these little, you know, statues or pictures that you would bow down to and pray to and burn incense to and offer sacrifices to and offer your worship to. And God says that all of those are going to be wiped out. Now, another bit of biblical theology that's very fundamental, just like any place can be a high place, anything can be an idol. Because by definition, an idol is anything that you put in place of or before the one and only true God. Okay? An idol is when you take something that is not God, okay, and you go, well, let's see, put it here, and then we'll put it here, and then we'll put it right here, because I mean, it's like really important to me, and then yeah, let's put it right there. That's what idolatry is. And so idolatry is not just about ancients making statutes. It's about us saying, you know, if I got a choice between being generous like God commands, and being greedy like I want to be, I think I'll go with the greed. What have you just done? You made an idol out of money. If I have a choice between listening to God and what he says about human intimacy and go, yeah, but, you know, I got these drives and these desires, and so, you know, what have you done? You made an idol out of intimacy. Just like anything can be a high place, anything can be an idol. Now, the reason I say this verse is so hopeful is because of this word that comes up 3 times in this verse. How many idols are going to be broken to pieces? All of them. How many temple gifts are going to be burned with fire? All of them. How many images are going to be destroyed? All of them. That's actually a note of hope. And here's why. Whatever it is that you're struggling with when it comes to idolatry, eventually, God's going to help you out with that. Now, maybe not in the way that you want him to, but he's going to help you out with that. Every idol that we make for ourselves eventually gets knocked down. The money that we rely on, you can lose that. The lust that you struggle with, that might be revealed so that you can get help with that. Whatever it is. It always and eventually gets knocked down. Not because God hates you, but because God loves you and he knows that this cannot do. He can. He wants better for you than this. He wants this. And so, Micah continues. In verse 8, because of this, Micah says, here's how I'm going to conduct my ministry. Okay? So I've kind of, shown you what God's indictment is, and, God's not happy with you. He's going to get rid of all your idols. Because of this, I'm going to weep and wail. I'm going to go about barefoot and naked. Hi, my name's Micah. I'm barefoot. I'm naked. I'm your pastor. Nice to meet you. Okay, kind of interesting. We'll come back to that, because this verse actually, believe it or not, the barefoot and naked verse is the key to Micah's ministry in this chapter. Okay, it's an incredible verse. So, hi, I'm the naked pastor. Okay, I'll howl like a jackal. Okay, it just keeps getting more interesting. Okay, and I'll moan like an owl. This guy's a weirdo. Got it. Come back to that. Verse 9, beginning here, what Micah does is he rips off a huge list of place names that are all over the nation of Israel, both in the north and both in the south. And all these place names in ancient Israel actually mean something in Hebrew. Okay, and what Micah is doing, and we'll see this, okay, is he is describing all of the different ways that people try to deal with their sin, with their idolatry, with their high places. All of the different ways that people say, I got sin and I can fix it. And so we'll just kind of read through these verses because it's kind of the same theme over and over and over again. He says, for Samaria's plague is incurable, and it's spread to Judah. It's reached the very gate of my people, even to Jerusalem itself. Now, as he sets up this list of place names, he says two things about sin, okay? Number one, for Samaria's plague is what? Incurable. Okay, all these place names are going to talk about how we try to cure our own sin. Okay, Biblical Theology 101. Can you cure your own sin, yes or no? No. You need someone to cure it for you. It's a fool's errand to say, I can fix my sin. I can make myself righteous. I can make myself perfect. It's incurable. But then here's the other thing about sin, okay, as he kind of sets this up. Samaria's plague is incurable. That's the northern half of Israel. What does sin always do? It always spreads. It spreads. And it spreads in two ways, okay? It spreads in you, and it spreads from you. Here's what I mean. A sin that you struggle with, that you don't get help with, it will like take over more and more of your heart, and more of your life, and more of your passions, and more of your desires. Now, we have to have a clinical word for this, right? We call this addiction. Addiction is sin that spreads in you. But not only does sin spread in you, it also spreads from you, which basically means it affects those around you. Personal sin is never just personal. It's never just personal. It does hurt your marriage. It does hurt your kids. It does hurt your job. And even if you don't think it is right now, it will eventually later. Okay? There's a future, right, that your present is going to affect. It will later. And so sin spreads in you, it spreads from you, and now here are all the foolish ways that we try to deal with sin. Verse 10, tell it not in Gath. Now, the Hebrew word Gath means to tell. And so here's one way that people try to deal with sin. They talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about anything but the sin. Lots of empty, hollow words. And Micah says, you know what? All those empty, hollow words are going to be shut up. You're not going to be able to talk about it. Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. How about in Beth Ophrah? Okay, Beth Ophrah, Hebrew phrase that means house of dust. Okay, here's another way that people try to deal with it. Okay, they basically go, hey, I am worthless, I am awful, I am terrible, and there's no hope for me. This is not repentance. This is self-pity. And Micah says, well, you can just roll in the dust. It's not going to do you any good. Okay? You can pass by naked and in shame, you who live in Sephir. The word Sephir means delightful. And so here's another way that people try to deal with sin. Oh man, I'm falling apart inside, but hi, I'm happy and everything's great. Let's put on a happy face. Well, guess what? Eventually that happy face is going to be ripped off and you're going to be exposed, naked and in shame. Okay. Those who live in Zanan will not come out. Okay, Zanan itself means come out. And so here's another way that people try to deal with sin. I'll just try to run away from it. That person that I hurt, I just won't talk to anymore. Micah says, you're not going to be able to deal with your sin that way. Your sin runs faster than you. You can't just run away from your past mistakes. You got to confront them. Okay, here's another way that people try to deal with sin. Beth Azel is in mourning, and it no longer protects you. Now, Beth Azel literally does mean house of protection. And so here's another way that people try to deal with sin. They try to build a fortress around their sin. I'm going to protect myself and my sin. This is, again, hiding. We'll see a lot of themes of hiding come up in here. But eventually, that fortress will be torn down, and the truth will be revealed. Those who live in Moroth, rather than pain, waiting for relief. Moroth is a word that means bitter. And so here's another thing that happens to people in their sin. They just wind up bitter. They just wind up bitter. This especially happens with people who not only commit sin, are sinned against, right? And what they do is they never deal with sin by grace, and so they just become bitter because of someone who sinned against them. Disaster has come from the Lord, Micah continues, even to the gates of Jerusalem. By the way, the name Jerusalem means city of peace. But in the city of peace, there's going to come what? Disaster. Because even if you go to the temple and offer your sacrifices, that's not what makes peace with God. You who live in Lachish, the word Lachish means invincible. Harness fast horses to the chariot. Try to make yourself as invincible as you can, okay? Be a mighty warrior. It's not going to help you. Okay, you who were where the sin of daughter Zion began, for the transgression of Israel was found in you. Therefore, you will give parting gifts, and then this is critical, to Moresheth Gath. Go back to Micah 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Micah of where? Moresheth. Moresheth. This is Micah's hometown. And so Micah indicts his own hometown in the middle of all of these other indictments because Micah knows something. He may be a prophet, but just because you're a prophet doesn't make you perfect. Doesn't make you perfect. And so the same indictment that is coming for them is coming for him. Micah, in one sense, is standing. This is really interesting. Micah is standing in solidarity with sinners. Does that remind you of anyone? Maybe one who wasn't a sinner but came to earth and stood in solidarity with sinners anyway, and maybe even took the place of sinners. Does that remind you of anybody? He says, you know what? The punishment that is coming to thee is also a punishment that is coming to me, and I am willing to endure that punishment. Well, does that remind you of anyone? The town of Akzib, which by the way in Hebrew means deception, will prove deceptive to the kings of Israel. Here's another way that people try to deal with their sin. They just lie about it. Oh no, I didn't do that. Oh no, I didn't take that. I'll bring a conqueror against you who live in Marashah. The word Marashah means conqueror. Here's another way that people try to deal with their sin. To conquer their sin by themselves. If you've ever struggled with sin, you know it's really hard to conquer it by yourself, and you will fail again and again and again. The nobles of Israel will flee to Adullam. Adullam means a hiding place. Again, I'll just try to run from my sin, hide from my sin, pretend it doesn't exist. It doesn't work. And so what does work? What works to deal with sin? Now, this leads us to the last verse of this chapter. Shave your head in mourning for the children in whom you delight. Make yourself as bald as the vulture, for they will go from you into exile. Now, that's how chapter 1 ends, and you go, whoa. But here's what Micah is saying. Shaving your head in the ancient world was a picture of repentance, of simply saying, I'm sorry. I've messed up. I know I deserve exile, but I need help. And so in the second half of this chapter, Mike is presenting us with two different ways to deal with sin. Okay? One is the way of, I'm going to cover it up. I'm going to run from it. I'm going to puff my chest out and pretend it doesn't exist. I'm going to try to conquer it myself. I'm going to try to deal with it myself. I'm going to go through every place name I can think of to try to deal with my own sin. And the other is the way of, I'm just going to shave my head and go, oh man, I've made a mess and I'm sorry and I need some help. One is the way of human effort. I can handle this. I got this. I can manipulate this. The other is the way of humble reliance. I can't handle this. I don't got this. Oh God, please help me. So, here's the question. When it comes to sin, which way is your way to deal with it? The way of the cities of Israel, or the way of the prophet Micah? Now, this takes us back to verse 8, and this is where I want to land with this weird prophet, right, who weeps and wails and goes about barefoot and naked. He howls like a jackal and he moans like an owl. Here's Micah. And Micah's ministry is devoted to warning the nation of Israel, okay, that all this is going to happen. But if they make a change now, they can prevent this in their future. Okay. You may know this from history. Does the nation of Israel make a change now? Yes or no? The answer is no. All of this still happens. This happens. God does punish the nation of Israel. He carries them off into exile. But here's what Micah does in verse 8. Rather than just getting angry and pounding his chest some more and going, how dare you? You know what? I've done my best. I'm out of here. You guys, terrible. You're not listening to me. Instead of doing that, he weeps and he wails. He humiliates himself. He strips down naked. And he howls like a jackal. And he moans like an owl. Because it's not so much that he's angry at Israel. It's that he's brokenhearted over Israel. That's what Israel's sin finally does to Micah. And so from this chapter, we learn this incredible lesson, which is this. Have you ever tried to warn somebody like Micah's warning Israel? Usually it's your kids, right? Don't do that. I don't want you to learn from the school of hard knocks. I did it that way. I want something different and better for you. And do your kids always listen? No. And it drives you nuts. Okay, this is Micah. He's their spiritual father. Kids aren't listening. And it's driving him nuts. But rather than just getting angry, okay, he mourns. And here's a real valuable lesson that we can all learn. When dealing with sin and when people don't listen to us, try to help them, okay, even when someone doesn't listen, still mourn with them. In other words, if you warn somebody not to do something and they do it, okay, and then exactly what you said was going to happen happens, your response probably shouldn't be this. I told you so. It's so tempting, isn't it? But Micah gives us a different response. Not I told you so, but I'm sorry. And I still love you. And I'm still there for you. And you know what? This hurts me so much to watch you like this. I'm going to howl like a jackal and moan like an owl. But I'm not going to leave you. And so ultimately, there are two ways to deal with sin: anger or grace. Saying, I'm done with you, or I'm there for you. One way leaves people in their sin. The other way rescues people from their sin. And that's the ministry that Micah is called to. What ministry are you called to? That's Micah 1. We'll be in Micah 2 in 2 weeks, to be continued. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your prophet Micah. These are hard words. This is a tough chapter. Micah opens with a lot of judgment and a lot of indictment and all these city names. And yet, in the middle of it all, right there in the middle of the chapter, is a man who is brokenhearted over sin. May we too be brokenhearted over sin and respond to it, not with anger, but with grace. Heavenly Father, if there's a sinful place that we see in somebody else's life, if there's a sinful place that we see in our own lives, may we respond like Micah, but even more than that. May we respond like Jesus. And we pray in his name.